It just takes a lot of time for public institutions to pivot to meet the labor market need. And that's really important. And that's not going to get easier. It's going to get tougher going forward when the skills that we require are going to change more quickly and more often.
How can a set of skills lead you down the path to success? That's what we're setting out to answer on the EdUp Canada podcast. I'm your host, Michael Sangster. Join me as we unpack how leaders around the world have taken training and skills and turned that into a lasting career. Now let's learn together. Welcome back to the EdUp Canada podcast. I'm Michael Sangster, your host, and I am excited to have with me an old friend from Ottawa, a community builder, a former cabinet minister, senior member, now you're senior now, a senior member of the Conservative Party of Canada. John Baird is joining us today to talk about politics, talk about careers, talk about employment, but talk about life too. John, how are you? It's been a while since we've seen each other. Life's treating you well these days? You're a busy guy.
Life is good. Enjoying my post-political days. There is life after politics. I have the best of both worlds. I can be in the private sector and watch Pierre Poilievre lead the Conservative Party in a fantastic way and lead our country in a fantastic way after the next election. So it's a win-win for me.
That was pretty definitive. He's not running. He's staying on the sidelines. It's good to get that out of the way early. I was intrigued. I went back and did a little digging. We did some fun stuff with the Ottawa Food Bank and some other groups. We've got a lot of mutual friends. But how does somebody who got charged with trespassing get to where they are today? Wasn't that how you started your political career, getting charged with trespassing?
I don't know about starting, but I was actually at a political protest when I was 19 years old at Queen's University. And the then Premier of the day, David Peterson, was campaigning on behalf of an unknown Liberal candidate in Kingston. And I was handing out pro-free trade flyers and got arrested. Guy Journo, who went on to be Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Harper and Chief of Staff to Premier Harris, was my lawyer. He was a student at law at the time and got me off on the charges. I subpoenaed both the Premier and the Liberal candidate to my trial before they dropped the charges. And David Peterson was the Premier, and he was the mover of my membership in the Toronto Club. And the unknown Liberal candidate got my vote for Speaker in every ballot in 2006 and 2008, Peter Milliken. So what a small world we live in, eh?
Well, you're a bit old school in the world these days in politics in that it's gotten very personal in Ottawa. It was never personal to you, was it? It was always about people trying to serve.
There was a few people that would get personal with, but by and large, I tried to keep it on the issues. Parliament is a bit of a theater. And I gave as good as I got, but I tried not to take it too seriously. Take your job and your responsibility seriously, but don't take yourself too seriously.
Well, you were known as one of the straight shooters. I remember sitting in your office one time talking about an issue, and you looked me in the eye and said I should just stop because we weren't going to get anywhere with the current cabinet. And you were giving us some very strong advice. It wasn't your file, and you were not wrong. I'm struck, actually. I was at the other end of the country working for Prime Minister Turner during the 8/8 election. And didn't get charged with trespassing, but we did get in a few tussles. As you remember that campaign, it was pretty aggressive, wasn't it?
That was a very aggressive campaign.
There was a lot of protesters, a lot of anxiety. I would argue we were wrong. Mr. Mulroney and his brethren were right about free trade, weren't they?
I believe we were, but Mr. Turner was a great man.
A great man, and sadly, we didn't get a chance to celebrate him.
On the first page of Steve Paikin's biography on Turner, he quotes me as saying that man didn't get the send-off he justifiably deserved.
That was, to me, one of the tragedies of COVID. I know it sounds minor, but he deserved to lay in state. He was a great Canadian. Not a long prime minister, but a great Canadian. So
I thought some of the media were rather short-sighted and petty when they let off, John Turner, prime minister for X number of days. I mean, he served our country so well as a consumer minister, justice minister, finance minister, leader of the opposition in corporate Canada. He was a good Catholic who would from time to time intervene in government to support the church. So he was a good man.
Well, and he and Mr. Mulroney, Prime Minister Mulroney, it was never personal between the two of them either. They remained friends for life.
Yes, indeed. And they knew each other long before either of them was involved in politics.
Yeah, it was true service. So let's dive into a couple of topics here because we've managed to, cruise through 5 minutes without really getting anywhere yet. Your current role, you're working now with a lot of large companies. What challenge would you say they face that you assist them with the most? What keeps them up at night? You're obviously dealing with CEOs, executive vice president. What's keeping large companies up at night?
I think no doubt geopolitics has become a huge risk factor in the last 10 years, whether you're in the mining sector, whether you're in the natural resources sector. Governments around the world can cause a lot of problems for the global economy, but can also cause a lot of problems for individual companies. The two things that I realize is one is that I'm not sure government can create jobs, but it sure can kill them. And second, in the private sector, so much more focus, so much more attention goes on to the deployment of capital, and it can move from one province to another or one country to another very, very quickly.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right there. And we've seen, talk about geopolitics, let's just talk about North American politics. We sure saw a lot of noise during the last administration in the US with Canada, and those things matter to CEOs and board of directors of large companies, don't they?
Yeah, it's funny. I think the current federal government responded well to the initially to the challenge that was Trump, but then has accomplished very little, if nothing, with the current administration, even though they're the same political stripe. They haven't been able to embark on any new initiatives or solve any big problems. I think of things like softwood lumber. I look at the defense pact between the US, the UK, and Australia. Too often we're just left out on the sides.
So let's dive into an Ottawa boy. Let's talk about the leader of the official opposition, Pierre Poilievre. You think he is the man for the job of being prime minister? If I'm correct, you chaired his campaign to become leader of the party, and he's obviously soared since then. But you know him probably as well as anybody, being an MP from Ottawa near him. So tell me, why do you think he is the guy for the job?
I think he's genuine. I think he's honest. He's got a good footing. I'll give you an example. Pierre was my parliamentary secretary when we brought in the Federal Accountability Act. And in the midst of that, the Liberal opposition went after me saying, you want to reduce the influence of big money on politics. You want to have a more honest environment. Can you explain how your parliamentary secretary, who's carrying this ethics legislation, could possibly be wined and dined by the biggest company in Canada at a private rock concert in a box at the hockey arena in Ottawa? Pierre was 26 years old, only in the second term. And I was able to stand up and say, well, I hope you'll join me in congratulating the member. He wrote a check for the full amount, including beverages and hospitality, before he went, because that's what ethics means to this government. So he's got his feet planted on the ground. He knows who sent him to Parliament. He knows who he's asking for the trust and confidence to become Prime Minister. The single greatest thing I think a leader can have is the capacity to grow in the job. And I just watched Pierre grow so much over the last 10 years, getting into cabinet finally in 2013. Then when I left, he became a full minister in a big department, almost losing his seat in 2015, going through the change from government to opposition, finally getting married and having 2 kids. He really grew in that, and then becoming finance critic. He's just really skyrocketed from there in terms of his capacity to lead.
He's sure riding high now. What do you think a Pierre Poilievre government looks like?
I think first and foremost, it's going to return to competent macroeconomic policy. We saw Brian Mulroney changed the country in 1984. Mr. Kretschmer stuck with that same competent macroeconomic policy, as did Mr. Harper. And I think that's the first thing he'll do. He will focus on the concerns of the average Canadian, things like inflation, the cost of living, things like crime, where people are calling out for a different direction. And I think what you see is what you get. He's going to follow through on what he's been campaigning on.
I'm trying to think back to whether or not he was sitting in the telesuite with me for that concert now. I know he came to a hockey game with us once and paid for his ticket in advance. So it's an interesting story for people to hear.
He's certainly not out for the free lunch.
No, and he wasn't out to do a lot of those things either. You don't see him at a lot of the functions. He didn't see him at a lot of those things, right? He was more about doing the work, wasn't he? Or still is.
I think the reason why he's resonating so well with Canadians and the direction he's taking the party is he's been out in the far reaches of the country doing a lot of listening, whether that's in rural Newfoundland or whether that's on Vancouver Island or every place in between. He's done a lot of listening. And when he talks to a widow who paid $1,325 of the carbon tax in 6 weeks to fill her oil tank for home heating in rural Newfoundland, those stories affect him and cause him to take those issues to the floor of the House of Commons. And on a number of issues, he's got the government to move.
I can tell you that some of my members have seen him. It's funny you mentioned Newfoundland. I know I've had some members mention they've seen him in Vancouver and in St. John's at different events, and they left very impressed. Clearly a very, very good communicator, isn't he?
And I think he's going to be able to speak to people in areas of the country where we haven't traditionally done well. I was in a meeting last November, and I said to the meeting that Pierre could very well be the first Conservative leader to win Newfoundland and Labrador. And the chair of the meeting pointed out that he had won Newfoundland and Labrador in 1984. So I had to correct myself and say the second Conservative leader.
That's a funny comment. Question out of nowhere for you, John. Who's the star in his caucus that none of us know? Can you think of one that's going to really surprise us?
I think one who's not front and center, but is a real up-and-comer and very smart. Adam Chambers, the new MP for Simcoe North. Really smart guy, MBA, LLB, married, 2 kids, got elected in Simcoe North from Midland, Ontario. He's helping write the platform, leading the platform development. I think he's one to watch.
Oh, that's interesting because there's always one or two that come out of nowhere. Making a cabinet's not easy, and he'll have a big challenge should he win the next election, but that's a name I've heard many people talk about.
He's a great guy.
You and I share a friendship with a couple of gentlemen, Mark Spiro and Chad Rogers, who I do a lot of work with these days. And we had Chad on a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him this question, and it was about just taking a rip about civility in politics. Is it better or worse? But here's my question. Does it matter if it's going to be better or worse? And Chad went on a rant about it doesn't really matter.
By nature, we have an adversarial parliament. We have the government on one side and the opposition on the other. And it's the opposition's job to hold the government's feet to the fire. There's a lot of fertile issues for the opposition with this government. So it certainly gets heated. It gets tough. But I think that's just a reality of where we are. Probably the media have contributed a lot to that. They like hot fire for their reporting. And second is social media. We've gone from a news cycle. There were newspapers and at 11 p.m. news was on once a day to 24-hour news now to 24/7 with social media.
Well, Chad got talking about, we asked the same question. He got talking about the Gutenberg Bible. And it was quite interesting because he said elites then were worried that the Gutenberg Bible would allow people to read it that didn't understand it. And that was his explanation of social media now. The elites are all concerned about it, that it gives everybody a voice.
Gives everyone a voice. I know it's maybe not in Quebec, but in English Canada, the mainstream media, the legacy media, just doesn't have the power and authority that it once had. When I was growing up, CBC television would break in on the main network to cover the budget and the budget presentation in its entirety. Now, CBC News World cuts out after 3 or 4 minutes of the minister speaking in Parliament and has some 22-year-old kid with pimples giving commentary. The CBC, few people watch it. The Globe and Mail editorial page doesn't have the influence whatsoever that it had 25 or 50 years ago.
And you and I have been around long enough. This is the first budget I've seen in my career where most of it was on the floor before the minister even stood up, right? It had all been pre-announced.
All been pre-announced and got virtually unanimous condemnation. I mean, I think you had, by my count, 3 former finance ministers of Liberal governments even come out against it. So obviously when governments get near the end of their time in power, they start to get desperate and do silly things. And this government is certainly following that trend.
You're doing a lot of work around corporate Canada. We've been talking about career colleges and the training that the members that I work with on a daily basis to make sure we got the workers we need to drive our economy. You've been at the federal, you've been at the provincial level. Can you think of a policy or an initiative or things that federal or provincial governments could do that would help career colleges train the workforce we need?
I think being more open-minded on private delivery of education is a good thing. I think the provincial government here in Ontario has done a number of initiatives, number of approvals, which I think is very positive. So many of our educational institutions at the post-secondary level require foreign students as a revenue stream to support their initiatives. And I have to tell you, I just got back from the Middle East, and our reputation in international education around the world is just in tatters. People say, what has happened to Canada? International students, from China don't come anymore. From India, they've been smacked down, not being able to get access. And of course, there's a crisis in funding now been created on every college and university campus, certainly in Ontario and likely around the country. We've taken some big hits.
I was in British Columbia yesterday, and they were talking about I think it was 8 institutions that ran deficits last year they're not allowed to. So they have to come back to the Treasury, come back to the legislature to look for money to cover their deficits. There's a lot of pressure that's there. You look
at what happened at Laurentian University. You look what's going on right now at Queen's University. They've been hit hard. Universities and colleges have been hit hard, not just with the tuition cut, but the freeze for 6 years. They just don't have the source of revenue they need to run their operations. So they've had to look for foreign students. Now they've had that smacked down as well.
Yeah, no, it's caused a huge pressure. The irony is that we were attacked during that international student debate this year, but The irony is that we only had 4.4% of the international student study permits last year in our sector, but we commonly get blamed for it and get attacked for it.
Yeah, I do feel badly for the provincial governments because they've had to deal with the smackdown from Ottawa, no consultation, and it's basically put the sector in huge peril.
Every provincial government I've spoken to has shared their frustration of no warning, no collaboration, no work. Just a minister stood up at a podium and all of a sudden made all these drastic changes to them, which have impacts. And it's interesting to get your reaction. So you're saying the international reputation now for Canada is in tatters on this file.
On foreign education, foreign students coming to Canada, it's going to take a good 5 or 10 years to fix this.
And you're going to recommend a change in government to help fix that, aren't you?
Michael, I think that's a good idea, a good suggestion. And if you wanted to suggest it, I would accept that proposal.
I think by the time this airs, you're going to say that I suggested it anyway. So that's good to move forward.
No, but I mean, we've just got so many challenges globally. I mean, whether it's India, whether it's China, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's at the NATO table. Last year, I was in New York, and there was a former Prime Minister of Australia who was complaining vociferously against our government when he was in office. And I mean, it takes a lot to screw up the Canada-Australia relationship, but this government has delivered.
And I remind people, you were the Minister of Foreign Affairs, so you do have a background to understand these issues too. This isn't just an ex-politician piping off here, is it?
And we had great, with China. The first 3 years were very tough with the Harper government, but we really left the Canada-China relationship in solid shape. India was at an all-time high, I think, in terms of productive relationship that Prime Minister Harper had with Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Singh. In the Islamic world, in the Arab world, in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, we had phenomenal relations, concluded a $13.5 billion arms deal. And you can see above me the light armored vehicle model of that. And, and they respect even the fact that we had a different policy than they had on Israel. They respected us. We took a tough line with Iran. We took a tough line on radical extremism. And we had a great relationship.
I was on one of those trade missions with Prime Minister Harper to China, where we signed a contract representing TELUS at the time. And the relationship was strong. It was good. And there was a lot of conversations that went on. And I can imagine the ones that went on in the back rooms that nobody could see that came along with doing economic activity, right?
Everyone else is there. President Xi was just in France. The German Chancellor was just in Beijing. President Biden has sent 6 senior cabinet members there in the last year. And we're MIA.
And we'll pay a price for that, won't we?
We already are.
Let's get back to students, because you got a different perspective on this. But what would we as a society do? Set up students, new or mature, and our students are traditionally more mature, usually in their 30s, 65% female, single parents, taking a new start on a career. What would you say for them? Best things we could do to help them get lasting success?
I think we need to be much more agile and be able to pivot much more in the course offerings for post-secondary education and skills development. For example, 2 examples, artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. It just takes a lot of time for public institutions to pivot to meet the labor market need. And that's really important. And that's not going to get easier. It's going to get tougher going forward when the skills that we require are going to change more quickly and more often.
What's exciting you these days? What's driving you? What are you finding the most interesting thing you're working on?
I'm on the board of Canadian Pacific. We've got a leadership team in our management suite that's really firing on all 8 cylinders. We did the acquisition of Kansas City Southern. So now when I joined the board, we were 21st biggest company in Canada. And under Keith Creel, we've now are the 5th or 6th, depending on the day. We can take bitumen from Alberta all the way down to the Gulf Coast to be refined. We can now take produce from Mexico all the way into Chicago and Toronto and even Vancouver. We have a huge potential to strengthen the economic relationship with Mexico. And the great things are happening at that company, but it's only going to get better.
When you look at your own career, what do you think is the greatest skill you had that made you successful? And did you have it early in your life, or did you have to work at getting it?
I think first and foremost, I was probably a problem solver who was focused on results and not process. I think too often in government, on all parties, we get obsessed with process rather than results. I'm a problem solver and a results guy, and you have to work with others to get that done.
I'd argue you're a natural communicator too, though. You don't have a problem communicating a very succinct message.
Yeah, that's one of the real challenges in government on all parties, Liberal, Conservative, NDP, you name it, is that the capacity of a political leader, a minister, a parliamentarian, to communicate effectively. If you don't have that, it's very difficult to be successful. I can remember in my time in Ottawa and at Queen's Park, seeing some really smart, capable, even brilliant people who struggled to be able to deliver a message. That is one of the requirements for success.
Is there, and this is putting you on the spot, no warning, but somebody across the aisle that you really enjoyed working with, that you had a really good ability to cooperate with, that was from across the aisle in the legislature, maybe in Ottawa?
Pierre Poilievre and I, when we were at Treasury Board, we got to work with Pat Martin, the NDP member for Winnipeg Centre, who we were warned about. Oh, you can't trust this guy. You won't like this guy. You won't be able to work with him. And we made a huge deal with Pat and the NDP to get the ethics reforms passed. It was an unlikely trio that worked together to accomplish good things.
And then you did a lot of hard work with Wayne Wouters and others around the Accountability Act that's still sitting around. We're all dealing with that every day. It's had an impact, hasn't it?
I think there's no doubt that the ethics rules, the accountability structures were in need of a massive overhaul. There's been a lot of jurisprudence and a lot of interpretations of that perhaps have gone too far. But I think that recalibration was really required. And when I was appointed as president of the Treasury Board, Wayne Wouters, the secretary of the Treasury Board, I was really set up for success, not failure, because they assigned the A team to work on this project, and we were able to deliver it pretty quickly. It's never a bad thing to revisit things and look back. It's been almost 20 years to look back and see, is it time for review?
Wayne's a great friend from Saskatchewan. We've been golfing buddies and football buddies, going to Rough Rider games and Grey Cups together, but he is a world-class public servant, isn't he?
I used to tease him because he was my clerk. He was clerk of the Treasury Board, and then he got demoted from clerk to secretary of the cabinet.
Yeah, he's a good one. Lots of great stories there, and he's still continuing to consult people.
I was really set up when I was appointed Treasury Board, set up for success. He did a phenomenal job.
And there's a certain irony now that you're captured by the Accountability Act, isn't there?
Indeed.
Yeah, and you have to be careful by those rules. So let's finish up. We always ask this question of people because we think it's important in any post-secondary education system, but just in any career, any path. We've all had mentors who've helped us get where we are today. So who's your one? And it's funny to watch this process because I say it every time we do these episodes. I always think of a new one based on something somebody else says. So who's that mentor? And do you practice what they did for you when they mentored you?
I think I started to work for Perrin Beatty when he was a cabinet minister when I was 18 years old, and worked for him for 6 years until 1993, the day we were asked to leave. Who asked us to leave? The Canadian people collectively asked us to leave. But I learned from Perrin a few things: hard work, integrity, tell the truth, the shortcut, tell the truth. It's always shorter, easier, but hard work and ethics, I think, are two things that stood me in good stead, and that was Perrin's mentorship.
Do you think he knows he's a mentor to you?
I don't know. We'll see. Maybe he'll, of course, I'm sure he's a regular listens to your podcast, Mike.
Of course, he's one of the hundreds. It's interesting to find out how many people have not taken the time to stop and say, you know what, Perrin, this is what you meant to me. And I see he's taking off in a new direction now, leaving the Chamber of Commerce.
Indeed.
Finally, hanging up the shingle, hopefully a little bit of retirement time. So, John, let's leave it there.
He doesn't like the word retired, I'll tell you that. I wished him a happy retirement. He bit my head off.
Oh, so we think corporate boards is probably headed this direction. And I'm glad to hear we came to a couple of conclusions today. You are returning to politics is the first one I heard. Is that what you are? No, that's a no. And you do believe that a Pierre Poilievre government is the best solution to post-secondary education changes in Canada?
I really think that Pierre is going to provide great leadership for this country, principled leadership that you can respect, and most importantly, tackle the big issues: affordability, competent macroeconomic policies, tackle crime. I couldn't be happier with the leadership that he's provided.
That's some pretty clear messaging there. John and I are having a little fun because we've known each other a long time. Great to see you, John. Look forward to doing it in person soon. And thank you for joining us on the EdUp Canada podcast.
Good to be with you. Thanks, Doc.
Thanks, John. See you soon.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the EdUp Canada podcast. We release new episodes regularly, so make sure you hit that subscribe button so you know when they are officially out. If you love this episode, please leave a 4 or 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcasts so that others can also discover how a set of skills can lead to success. Thanks for learning with us.